Okay, I want to talk about this. Obviously, I just proxied a deck, and if you saw any of that clip, you might be wondering why. The reason is I want to talk about a combo, and this combo requires 60 cards, and at least one of them is way out of my price range. Uh, Not only is it hard to get a Black Lotus, but to get one that is misprinted with a 1/1 power and toughness on the bottom, essentially I can't afford that. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about this deck first before we get into what it's going to look like. This is a 60 card deck, which is fair. I wanted it to be a 60 card deck, and I wanted to make a combo. And the idea of the combo is that it's not supposed to be consistent, it's not supposed to go infinite. In fact, quite the opposite. I don't want it to go infinite, but I want to do a lot of damage despite that. And this is where this deck comes into play. I don't know how much damage it does. And in fact, if you were to ever use this combo, you would, again, probably not do very well in a tournament because not only would you lose if you can't, if you get it to go off, you would, or if you don't get it to go off, which is basically every game, but if in the moment the stars align, uh, you still would be able to name the number that you're able to deal in terms of damage because it is an actual number, so you'd probably still lose. But that's a separate issue. So I want to talk a little bit about this combo. It's going to be split up into 3 stages. There is a setup, the actual combo portion, and then the final wrap up of the combo. And the reason I'm breaking it up into these 3 parts is because this entire 60 cards is dedicated to this single combo, and it's rather confusing because there's a lot of moving parts. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll just get started, and you can see what I'm talking about here. We're going to start off by having our hand be at least 5 of these 7 cards. We're going to skip these 2 really quick. Let's just assume that we have these 5 cards in our opening hand. We've mulled down to 5, but that's okay. My combo only requires that we have 5 cards, these exact 5 cards, of which there are no duplicates in the deck, in our opening hand. So as long as we do that, we're golden. I suspect this will happen quite often if you're playing this deck, because you're going to have to cheat if you want any chance at winning, and you're playing a Black Lotus in what is most likely a format that doesn't legally let you have one. So we're going to go ahead, tap, sacrifice this, and use Channel, which allows us to tap, sacrifice it. You have 3 green mana floating, and I'm going to use 2 of it for Channel. We're going to use the last floating one. A Channel allows us to pay life for colorless mana, so we're going to use the Channel ability to go down to 1 life. We have 20 mana floating, 1 of it is green. What we're going to do is use that to cast Mycosynth Lattice. Mycosynth Lattice has a couple different abilities, but the 2 key things are that we can spend mana as though it were mana of any color, which will be useful for our next step and also to wrap up the combo. And then also all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types, which is going to be very useful for the setup. And also it's going to be a key part of what makes this combo work. We're going to then play an Omniscience. That way we can play the rest of our cards essentially for free, and we don't have to worry about mana because that's what we're here for. So 10 mana up front, much cheaper. We spent 16 of our 20 mana. We have 4 mana floating, but we don't need to worry about that anymore. We're going to play Enter the Infinite, and we're going to draw our deck. So at this point, these cards are no longer relevant. We draw our deck. We're going to place 1 card, a sacrificial card, onto the top of our deck, and I've chosen a Colossal Dreadmaw because so we take the L on the Colossal Dreadmaw, but that's okay. The next thing we're going to do is draw the rest of the deck here, and I'm going to just keep it face down my hand so that way things aren't too distracting, and I will reveal the cards as we go. So next, we're going to follow up by playing a March of the Machines. March of the Machines turns all artifacts into creatures. So at this point, all permanents from now on will be our creatures. They will a creature. So right now we have 3 creatures. This is going to become very relevant very quickly. We're going to turn all of our creatures into slivers. This is going to be, again, very relevant very quickly. Whoop, you didn't see that. Next, I have a Mana Echoes. When Mana Echoes enters the battlefield, we get mana equal to the number of creatures that share a creature type with the creature that entered the battlefield. Mana Echoes is a creature because it's turned into an artifact and then turned into a creature. So Mana Echoes is a creature. And it, like all other permanents that I have that are creatures, is a sliver. So when it enters the battlefield, I get 5 mana. So this is going to become relevant. I won't keep track of the total amount of mana we have. It'll become very obvious as to why I've considered it futile, hopefully very quickly. Next, we're going to play a Mirror Gallery. The Legend rule doesn't apply. This is more optional. I just have it in here for fun. I could actually use it to this is here. We have that. Next, we're going to play Zada, Hedron Grinder. The reason we're picking Zada is because Zada is a fun card to play. So, at this point, we have gotten 5 mana, 6 mana, and 7 mana. So that's 12 mana. No, that's a lie. 18 mana floating. So we have 18 mana. Right? We're going to play Eye of the Storm. That's another... And we're going to set this just a little over here, because it's going to become relevant later on, as well as the Zada. We're going to play a Spiteful Silver. This is not going to be that relevant until the wrap-up, but we're going to set that aside here. At this point, all of my creatures now, or all of my permanents are now creatures that are slivers, and they all have the ability, whenever they're dealt damage, they deal damage to target creature or planeswalker. A Doubling Season, because any good combo that's really cares about itself is going to obviously have a Doubling Season. And we'll set that aside over here too. And the Mana Echoes, just for fun. Next, we're going to play 4 Abhorrent Overlords. Each of these, when they enter the battlefield, they're 6/6 flyers. Although I did not cut out any of the proxy tokens properly, so their power and toughness is missing. That's not a big deal. That's not relevant to the combo. The big relevant thing is its ETB trigger. When it enters the battlefield, you get 1/1 black harpies equal to your devotion to black. Your devotion to black is equal to the number of black mana symbols you have on permanents you control. You're going to get the harpies equal to your mana symbols, so all of the harpies are also going to trigger the Mana Echoes. You're going to get mana equal to that as well. So at this point, we have a lot of floating mana. Way too much floating mana. In fact, after these 4 Abhorrent Overloads enter, we are going to have a total of 40 1/1 harpies. Each one will have triggered Mana Echoes and caused us to get a ton of mana. So this point now we have finished our setup. And our setup is important because the rest of the abilities are going to be targeting Zada with copy spells. And to maximize that, so what we're going to do is we're going to have 4 copies of Rite of Replication. They're all going to get cast targeting Zada. Now, setting this aside, you'll have to forgive me that there's not a lot of space. I'm going to consolidate the Abhorrent Overlords. And I will consolidate some of these more unimportant things. So, I kind of glossed over some of these abilities here. We know what Mana Echoes and Doubling Season does, but I glossed over Eye of the Storm. I didn't really mention it, because it becomes relevant at this point. And same with Zada. Zada's ability is that if you cast a spell or an instant or sorcery that only targets Zada, it's going to copy the spell for each other, well, creature you control. In this case, it would be each other permanent you control, and it's going to target every other permanent. So in this scenario here, Rite of Replication, if I target Zada with it, and I kick the Rite of Replication, it's going to also target Eye of the Storm, Mana Echoes, Doubling Season, all of my Abhorrent Overlords, every single one of my 40 Harpies, the Mirror Gallery, Hivestone, March of the Machines, Omniscience, Mycosynth Lattice, and Spiteful Silver. We're going to get a copy of every single one of those. And with Doubling Season out, we are going to get 10 more copies of every single thing with our first Rite of Replication. So, at this point, I now have 11 of everything on my board state, except for the Harpies, because we have 4 new Abhorrent Overlords enter, And all of those are going to see the not only all the 2 to the power of 11 or the 11 doubling seasons now that we have, because it's the original one plus the 10 new ones, but also it's going to see all of the old devotion symbols. You get 10 of each of these, so it would be big number. Then what we're going to do is exile it onto the original Eye of the Storm. We're going to exile everything onto the same Eye of the Storm, so we'll use the original one. We won't use any of the token copies. Those will be extra creatures for later on in the combo, but we're going to only exile onto the original Eye of the Storm. That way, we don't have to worry about the original Eye of the Storm trigger, or we don't have to worry about keeping things separated. So everything's going to get exiled onto the original Eye of the Storm. And what's going to happen is from this point on, Eye of the Storm has it. So if you cast an instant or sorcery, you may choose to exile it into Eye of the Storm. Well, you don't choose, you just do. You exile it into Eye of the Storm, and from that point on, every time you cast an instant or sorcery, you also cast. You actually get to play, which is important, the copies from Eye of the Storm. So that allows you to play that copy without paying its mana cost, which means you do cast it, which will trigger Zada. So our second Rite of Replication comes in. We are going to kick this Rite of Replication here. We are going to also kick the copied version of Rite of Replication off of Eye of the Storm, so we now get 2 copies, or 2 versions of Rite of Replication. Both will target Zada, which means both of them will copy for every other permanent we control. And we now have another giant pile of things. We're going to do this 2 more times with Rite of Replication, and at this point we have cast Rite of Replication a total of 10 times, because with the first one we cast it once, the second one is going to be 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So after we've cast Rite of Replication 4 times, in reality we've actually gotten 10 kicked versions of Rite of Replication out of it. After that, Saheeli's Artistries. The reason we picked Saheeli's Artistries is because it has 2 abilities. You can copy a token as well, artifact, as well as creature, and you can then use that to also cast copies of Rite of Replication again. So we're going to get another 4 casts of Rite of Replication for each of these Saheeli's Artistries, as well as each Saheeli's Artistry casting the previous version of Saheeli's Artistries that have already been cast. Each of these is going to target Zada, and if you target Zada with both the copy artifact ability and copy creature ability, which can happen because, again, Zada is an artifact according to Mycosynth Lattice. So at this point, we're going to continue with replication techniques. The reason we choose replication technique next is because when you cast a spell, you may have an opponent copy it, and while that copy does not trigger Zada, that's just 1 extra cast we can use to copy and target our doubling season, which will increase our useful output slightly, at least a little bit. So we get 4 replication techniques. Again, each of these triggers every other spell that's on Eye of the Storm. So at this point, this pile here, every time I add a new card, every single card in that pile is then recast over and over and over again. And we can choose to kick all of our copies of Rite of Replication because that's an additional cost. It's not a modified or alternate casting cost. Once we reach the last 3 cards in our hand, though, we now have a board state where, again, I would like to mention we are copying all of the mana echoes, so each time we copy, each creature is going to enter the battlefield, get you mana equal to the number of other creatures you control, as well as multiplying that by the number of mana echoes you have, which again is an absurd number because it's growing at the same rate as the doubling season. So, really large number. And there's also a huge number of these Spiteful Slivers, which is about to become very relevant, because what we're going to do is we're going to cast Ajani's Presence, targeting Zada. The reason we choose Ajani's Presence. Next, we're going to use all of our floating mana that we have generated throughout the entire combo to cast March of the Multitudes. This allows us to again, get a ton of 1/1 creatures. And then finally, Chain Reaction. Chain Reaction deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. So now that we have all of these creatures, we have all of them blast each other for the total amount that they are, and every single one of these now has a set of Spiteful Sliver triggers for each creature, for each Spiteful Sliver you have. So each creature you have is dealt damage equal to the total number of creatures you have, and then they all deal damage equal to the amount they took times the number of Spiteful Slivers you have. At which point, you blast a person in the face for a ton of damage, and then you lose because you can't tell them how much damage you dealt. Now, we can narrow down a couple things. Let's just talk about one card in specific. And the reason I'm picking this card is because everything else essentially relies on it. But let's talk about this Doubling Season. This Doubling Season is cast, or not cast, but copied a bunch of times in the combo. Namely, you have a copy, starting with the original copy, and you double the amount of Doubling Seasons you have for each time one of these spells is cast. We can figure out how many times a spell is cast if we simplify it, or we can compute a lower bound for the Doubling Season pretty easily. Let's assume that the Rite of Replications, the Saheeli's Artistries, as well as the Replication Techniques, only ever target the Doubling Season, because it doesn't matter, or the Doubling Seasons, that they're only targeting that, and that they only copy one time, as opposed to the multipliers that they have, which is ×5, ×2, and times, well, not really times, but a +1 modifier. We can easily compute then how many, what a lower bound for this Doubling Season is, based on the total number of spells we cast. And the total number of spells we cast, spoiler alert, is 39. So, or not 39 total, but 39. There are 39 spells in this pile, and each one recasts all of the previous spells. So we can count how many there are, and that's equal to n times n plus 1 divided by 2. That's just the summation. So we have 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 all the way to 39. That's the closed form of that. And we can actually compute that as 780 total spells here. So what that means is the number of Doubling Seasons, we start at 2, at 2 to the power of 1, is actually equal to 2 to the power of 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 2. And we do know it's 2 to the power of 2 780 times cast. So essentially that's our lower bound for the number of Doubling Seasons, and everything else is based off of that number. There's no follow-up.